I don't mind.
Right. Okay. So hi everyone, welcome to the Toronto Data Workshop. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Professor Laura Derksen. Laura is the Amgen Canada Professor of Health System Strategy at the University of Toronto, and also an Assistant Professor in Strategic Management at Rotman. And so we've got a very interesting talk in terms of development, education, information, and networks. And so thank you very much for joining us, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm at Rotman, but I'm actually trained as a development economist. And most of my research is kind of randomized controlled trials to measure the impact of policy or to better understand human behavior, sometimes both. The project that I wanted to present today is an RCT that takes place in Southern Africa. That's where probably most of my work takes place. And as you mentioned, it's not actually a health paper. A lot of my work is health, but this one is kind of more about information, the internet, and how it can impact education. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is joint work with Catherine Michaud-Leclerc. She's a PhD student at the University of Toronto in econ, soon to be joining the University of Laval, and with Pedro Sousa, who's also an economist at Queen Mary University in the UK. So the internet has spread very, very, very quickly around the world, but especially in Africa and especially very recently. So the first time I went to Malawi, is a country in Southern Africa, was about 13 years ago, and there was no internet, like none, like you could not access it. And now it's just like there are cell towers everywhere. You can buy data packages, you can use your smartphone. It's been a really, really rapid expansion. And it's been extremely popular around the world and in Africa among young people. So people 15 to 24 are twice as likely to have ever used the internet than other groups in Africa. So this kind of presents some opportunities when we think about education, especially the fact that young people seem to love the internet. But when you look at the kind of existing literature on this, it seems like internet access doesn't actually have very much of a positive effect on learning. And there are a bunch of studies on this in different contexts. Maybe surprisingly, neither do textbooks. So providing textbooks to students doesn't really seem to impact learning either. So looking at this kind of existing literature, we kind of had this question of, but that can't be right. Like there must be some kind of role for the internet in schools, and we just haven't figured out yet what it is. And the reason we felt that there must be a role for the internet is that it's just such an incredible resource. It has up-to-date reading material on literally any topic you can think of. It's very engaging for young people, maybe more so than their books or the books that they would find in their school library. It has absolutely limitless information, much of it accurate, much of it not at all accurate. And then it has kind of endless scope for distraction. Social media, entertainment, games, conspiracy theories, you name it. So just thinking about these different components of the internet, you can kind of see why it might not have a super positive impact on learning. And yet, when you go to low resource settings, you come back to this question of, well, couldn't it? Because it's so much more feasible than bringing textbooks and books to kind of isolated locations. It's always up to date. It's so much more fun for students. And so this was kind of our motivation for this experiment. So what we did is we provided students who otherwise did not have internet access with access to a version of the internet that we think of as kind of preserving the best features from a policy point of view. So this was Wikipedia. It has this kind of like exciting, endless information on any topic, super up to date side to it, without some of the most like inaccurate information that you can find on the internet, and without all of the other kind of entertainment and distractions that students might be drawn away to. So we did a randomized controlled trial in 4 government boarding schools in Malawi. So this is a country with rapidly improving internet infrastructure, but where at the time of the study, which was about 4 years ago, most students had very little, if any, experience with the internet. It's also a country where study resources are pretty limited, so bringing in an outside resource could be really important. And because it was in government boarding schools, we were able to fully restrict internet access to Wikipedia. So just a quick kind of preview of what we find. First of all, the students just absolutely loved this resource. They were extremely enthusiastic about the project. They report finding Wikipedia useful, easy, trustworthy as a source of information. They used it a lot, so about an hour and 20 minutes every week, and each student browsed an average of 800 different pages, so very broad use. And they both report and actually used it for some topics that we think of as key topics for young people, and topics that are prone to misinformation. And I'm mostly talking about kind of sex and sexuality topics. In terms of academic outcomes, we pretty significant improvement in English exam scores. And this is driven entirely by students that were lower achieving at baseline. And our explanation for why we see this is that they're spending so much time reading in English, and that it's actually a resource that they find interesting to read, and that kind of compels them to spend time reading. We also see that to some extent they use it as a study tool, especially for biology, which is arguably the most important subject for these students. Many of them want to go on to a career in the health sector. And it's the most popular subject among students. It's also a subject where study materials are really important. So giving access to something that's like a textbook could make a big difference. Again, we see this mostly among lower achievers at baseline. And our explanation for this is that they find Wikipedia easier to use and understand than the textbooks they have in their library, and maybe than their teachers. Okay, so over the next little bit, I want to talk about what the intervention looked like, how we brought Wikipedia into schools. I want to talk a little bit about how students used Wikipedia and what they browsed. And then I'll show you our results on academic performance, and then we can discuss. Okay, so I think all of you know what Wikipedia is. Open collaborative encyclopedia. It's surprisingly accurate, and there's been a lot of kind of scientific work about just how accurate it is. But even for kind of academic subjects, surprisingly accurate. And of course, it provides reading material on any topic you could possibly think of, broad, compelling, easy to understand for students. And it's a very good resource for high school subjects. So to give you an example, I will show you just a screenshot of the Wikipedia page for photosynthesis. This is just like the first part. It scrolls on and on and on. It's much more detailed than what you would find in a high school textbook. It's also very easy to navigate, because if you find, you know, okay, I understand photosynthesis, but I don't understand the part about oxygen content, you can just click on that and read even deeper into each particular component of the concept. So super easy for students to use, with lots of pictures and diagrams and things like that. Another thing that you might not be aware of is that Wikipedia exists in a lot of different languages, including a simple English version, which is even easier for students to understand. And we had this available to them as soon as they logged in. So if they wanted to, they could look up a page in simple English, and it has sentences like, photosynthesis is the process by which plants and other things make food. So super, simple language for students who are learning in their, not in their mother tongue. And much, much easier than the level of their textbooks that they would have in their library. Okay, so our experiment took place in Malawi. This is a small, densely populated, landlocked country in Southern Africa, one of the poorest countries in the world, maybe the poorest country in the world. A very beautiful country, very friendly. I recommend it as a holiday destination, but a very interesting place to run an internet experiment because of how early they are on the kind of adoption curve. So the infrastructure is now present almost throughout the country, especially in any kind of urban or semi-urban area. You'll always have a 3G or 4G signal, and even in remote villages, you'll often get 2G or 3G. So they definitely see it as going in that direction. But at the moment, internet is still quite expensive for most people to use. So the GDP per capita in Malawi is about $300 per year. If you want to buy a smartphone, the cheapest smartphone you can buy in Malawi is about $50. 1 gigabyte of data is $3.50. So you can see that this is a pretty expensive good for Malawians to use. And indeed, as of 2015, which was kind of around the time of the experiment, only 12% of Malawians had ever used the internet. And those 12% were not using it, most of them were not using it the way we do. It's like you've tried it once on somebody's phone, your uncle's phone, you've looked something up, but it's not like you have a smartphone and you're using it all day, every day. So the actual experience with the internet was pretty low. And this makes it a very unique and setting for an experiment where you provide young people with the internet for the first time. So we ran an experiment in high schools, or secondary schools, as they call them in Malawi. As a matter of policy, they don't provide or allow internet access at school. In particular, they don't allow students to bring phones to school. They have fairly limited resources, so kind of small libraries with textbooks that students have to share amongst themselves. Yet this is high school, and it's high school at the kind of accredited at the UK level. So these are hard courses for students. They, are taking biology, physics, history, etc. You need good study resources to be able to do well in these subjects. And indeed, only 14% of Malawians actually complete secondary school. So there are many reasons for this, but one could be a lack of resources. So here we have a picture of one of the school libraries from our setting. So this is kind of a full wall of a 4-wall library, just to give you a sense of how big it is. And it's for a school of about 500 students. So it's not huge, it's not up to date. And you could imagine that students might not find the most exciting reading materials in here. So our sample consists of 4 government boarding schools. You should not think of these as fancy boarding schools. They're state schools, they're public schools. Students do have to pay fees, but they're not very high. And it's mostly targeting students who do quite well in primary school. So they're kind of higher than average achievers, but from across the income distribution in Malawi. They're not rich students. And in particular, half of them had never seen the internet before the study. So I think that gives you a kind of picture of what kind of students there are. And I should just say boarding schools are very, very common in Southern Africa. This isn't a kind of strange setting. So what we did is we kind of appropriated a classroom in the school to set up a digital library for 1 year. And it was open evenings and weekends. And inside the digital library, there were Android phones that had kiosk software on them not unlike what you might see if you go to the airport and they have those tablets and they're kind of like locked to certain apps. It's the same kind of thing. And the only thing that they could use on these phones was English Wikipedia, simple English Wikipedia, or Wiktionary. So those were the kind of icons that they had available to them. If they wanted to use one of these phones, they had to sit down at a desk inside the digital library and use it inside. So they couldn't take it out with them. And they had to use it quietly on their own, not in groups. And their browsing was anonymous. So they didn't, the actual content of what they were reading was not monitored by the staff. The staff would just kind of sit at the front of the room and make sure that nothing crazy was going on in there, but just kind of let them browse whatever they wanted. And they were told that they were free to browse whatever they wanted. And importantly, the students knew that their browsing was anonymous because in front of, you know, the whole class of students, they drew a username out of a hat. So there was really no way for us to link a particular student to what they were browsing. So here I have a picture of some girls. This is actually in the pilot of the study where we were just showing them Wikipedia and letting them kind of use it a little bit. But when it was actually implemented in the school, the browsing was all kind of individual, not in groups. And students would often bring notebooks with them and kind of take notes or work on their studies while they were browsing. So this was our randomized experiment. It's not every student at the school that got access to the digital library. In fact, it was a fairly sparse treatment. One reason for that is that we were afraid that if we treated half the students, the other half would feel really left out. So we only treated 1 in 5 students to try to frame it as a special pilot, not something that you either get or you don't. So we stratified students by school, by the grade level, whether they were a high or low achiever, and whether they had ever used the internet in the past. And then within each strata, we of students to digital libraries. And we told the students that it was going to be randomly assigned. And I think it was pretty obvious to them that it was, because it was such a mix of students who were chosen for the program. It wasn't like, you know, they could see that it wasn't the smartest students or the richest students or anything like that. So that means that we had a total of 301 students in the treatment group. So we collected a lot of data. We collected exam scores for the year before the program started, and then for all 3 terms during the school year. We also did some surveys at baseline and endline. And we collected all of the browsing data. So this kiosk software that we installed on the phones actually tracked every single page that the students visited, for how long, and so on. And we have this at the anonymous individual level. So we see a username and exactly how much they used it and what they browsed for the whole year. So let me start by telling you how they used Wikipedia. So as I mentioned, the students really loved it. They used it a lot. Every single treatment student used it. Most used it very frequently. So on average, they visited the digital library once or twice a week. They spent a total of 1 hour and 20 minutes per week browsing. And each student visited a total of 878 unique pages. So this should give you a sense of the kind of broad browsing that students did. It's not surprising to me as a person who loves using Wikipedia, but we're not going to be able to say, oh, this student used it for biology and this student used it for pop culture. It's like they all used it for a huge variety of different topics. But I will say that the amount of time they spent on Wikipedia varied quite a lot. So the average student spent about 26 hours total over the course of a school year. But there's a pretty heavy tail. So you had some students really spending a lot of time in the digital library. up to even 100 hours. So this is what our browsing data looks like. We see the username of the student, so it'll be like red 4. And even though this isn't linked to an individual, we do know something about the person based on their username. So the number tells me which school it was at, and the first letter of the username tells me some course and student characteristics. So was it a boy or a girl? Are they an upper year student or a lower year student? Are they a high achiever or not? But I can't say, okay, this was like so-and-so browsing. We see the page that they browse. So that Wikipedia term is the like page title. We see the time that the session started and the screen time stamp. So that allows us to see how long they spent on each of those pages. And then we actually figured out how to categorize pages ex ante. So this wasn't this category column wasn't part of the data that we collected. It's something that we defined. And I'm going to tell you more about how we did that. So just looking, you can see that they're kind of like bouncing around. This student was super interested in nuclear energy for a while, and then like Tales of Monkey Island, I'm pretty sure is a video game they must have heard of. And then I don't know why they're looking at marketing buzz. You can kind of, I find this quite funny just to see like what rabbit hole they ended up going down by clicking on things. I'm guessing that there's a nuclear accident in Japan in Tales of Monkey Island and they like clicked or something. But then they end up on Jennifer Lopez for the longest period of time, 238 seconds before logging off. So who knows? But I wanted to I was told that I could get into the weeds in this in this seminar. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we figured out how to categorize those pages, because it was hard, and I would be interested if anybody has thoughts about how to do it better next time around. But we actually used the Wikipedia category tree. So I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember Yahoo searches, but when you opened the Yahoo homepage, you would land on a page with topics, and you could actually kind of drill down into a specific drop down instead of just searching. And when you click on the Wikipedia homepage, that is not what it looks like. Whoops. So if you click on the Wikipedia homepage, you just have this kind of like collection of tidbits, but you don't have a set of topics. And for this project, I figured out that Wikipedia does actually have categories, and you can get there. But like everything on Wikipedia, it's user generated, and it's a little bit messy. So I am considering this main topic classifications as the top of a tree, but this is a very tangled tree with a lot of loops, and it's not like each page has one clearly defined top of the page. So for example, well, maybe let me show you if I can just, oh yeah, there we go. So I'll show you an example of a page. This is the page for Michelle Obama, which was one of the more popular pages visited by students. She was a very popular figure at the time, I think still is. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see all the categories that this page belongs to. And there are many. And depending on the one she actually has her own category. Not many people can say that. But depending on the one you click, like if I click on her category versus LGBT rights activists from the United States, you're going to end up at a very different point at the top of the tree. And with many different paths going through. So if I just kind of look at a single page, say like the page for Underground Railroad, it's going to have a bunch of different categories, right? And each of those categories is going to have a bunch of different categories. So we just scraped all of these categories from Wikipedia. and then all of the parent categories for all of the categories, and so on. Now we had to stop at some point because you have so many loops. So we stopped after 6 steps and looked at where we reached the top. So for example, for Michelle Obama, if you look at all of the paths with 6 or fewer steps, you end up with almost 1,700 different paths to the top of the tree. And so we're just using the top category that has the most number of paths. And if you just kind of eyeball the data, this most of the time looks right. So most people will end up with the category people at the top and not like food and drink, right? Even though she has 15 paths to food and drink. I don't know why. If you look at the page for pandemic, you get academic disciplines. Second would have been health. Kate McClear, that's a place in Malawi. You get geography. The page for sexual orientation, you get human behavior. So it's not too bad. Like it does a not too bad job. Okay, so using this categorization, we end up with a histogram that looks like this. So students are very interested in looking at people, celebrities, politicians, historical figures, current figures. A lot of it is kind of news events. You know, Wikipedia has news events on the front page when they log in. They might click on that, but that's the most popular kind of top category. And a lot of it is Michelle and Barack Obama, Donald Trump from this time period, stuff like that, but also local Malawian politicians, African celebrities, and so on. Entertainment, music, sports. So just kind of eyeballing this, it doesn't seem at first glance like they're really using it to study. That was my takeaway when I looked at this. But you know, academic disciplines is not too far down the list. You can think about like geography, health, mathematics. You know, some of this is probably related to school, but that's not my like overarching takeaway. They're mostly reading it for fun. We also, after glancing at the browsing data in like Excel spreadsheet form, we were motivated to check how much time they spent on topics related to sex and sexuality. I don't know why I didn't predict that this would be such a huge point of interest for teenagers, but it is. Maybe I thought it would be quite dry on Wikipedia, but we decided to try and see how much time they spend on this topic. So we just looked at human reproduction as a category, which is not at the top of the category tree, but we just said any page that is at that point is going to be categorized as sex and sexuality. Again, if you kind of eyeball it, it looks about right. It includes subcategories for both sexuality and sexual health. So whether you want to think about these as different or not, it accounts for a lot of browsing time. So 17% of their browsing time is on these topics. And the page for sexual intercourse is the top visited page overall by students. I think almost every student visited that page at least once. So of course you look at this and it is a mix of entertainment and information, right? They're not purely just looking for facts, I don't think, with this topic. But I would still kind of cast this in a positive light, given how much misinformation there is on this topic from other sources. So I would say, you know, students are going to talk to their friends, to their family, even their teachers in terms of the type of sex education that's offered is not always super fact-based. So at least you can say that Wikipedia is offering accurate information and that this is quite important for teenagers because of things like teen pregnancy concerns, but especially for teenagers in Southern Africa where HIV is still quite prevalent. So the next thing we wanted to do was actually carefully link their browsing to the syllabus. So the first thing we tried was just looking at categories like biology, but it's way too broad. First of all, human reproduction is a subcategory of biology. So you're going to end up with all of that, like all of that browsing being school related, which isn't really a fair characterization of what they were doing. So what we did was we actually got a copy of the Malawian school syllabus and matched it term by term. So if like the circulatory system is on there, we would include that. as a narrow subcategory, but not the kind of overarching biology subcategory. There were some examples from English, like there's a Wikipedia page for Macbeth. There's actually a category for Macbeth, math, trigonometry, plate tectonics for geography, but just to say, like, this was a careful matching, not a kind of course. Otherwise, if we use the course matching, it would be 99% of their browsing is somehow related to the syllabus, which isn't really accurate. So after this kind of careful matching, it looks like they spend about a fifth or a quarter of their time on the school syllabus. Biology is the most browsed subject. And, I think there are a few reasons for that. Again, it's a very popular subject for students. It's a subject where you need to study from a book or from study material, unlike kind of math or physics, where it's more about doing practice problems or gaining understanding or working in groups. Biology is one where you just need to learn the material. And it's really important for their career goals. You'll notice that English is pretty far down there because there aren't that many pages that really match the English syllabus. So this is going to come back to why I think it matters, why Wikipedia matters for English. And I don't think it's because they're reading pages on Macbeth, but we can come back to that. Okay, so if we look at the impacts on academic performance, we focus on those two subjects, and we actually pre-registered this ex ante because we believed that those would be the subjects impacted by Wikipedia. The reason we believed it would impact English is just because this is a reading resource, and we thought of this as a reading intervention that would be popular for kids. And then the reason we focus on biology, as I mentioned, it's a subject that really benefits from good study materials. It's the most popular subject, both in terms of like students naming it as a popular subject. It's also the subject that the most students sit their exam for. And it's really key for the career goals of students. And I'm going to show you in a few slides what those career goals are. But health related kind of doctor, nurse, health technician is the most popular kind of category of career goal for students in Malawi. So we didn't expect to see an impact on math or science because those topics are so dependent on problem solving skills, which are hard to learn on Wikipedia. Humanities, the students just don't really seem to care that much about their humanities subjects. So we didn't kind of prioritize those. And then Chichewa is the national language in Malawi, and there's a very limited Chichewa version of Wikipedia. So we didn't think that would have a big impact. Nevertheless, we did check what the impact was on those other subjects, mostly because we wanted to see if all of this time spent on the internet instead of studying for school. So our empirical strategy is just a regression framework where our outcome is the final exam score. So these are the kind of standardized school exams, regressed on whether they were in treatment or control. We control for the baseline exam score. We don't have to, but it gives us a little bit more precision in our estimates. And we put in dummies for each of the strata because we stratified the randomization. And all the exam scores we normalized at the form is grade. So at the grade and school level, it's just measured in standard deviations. So these are the overall impacts. You can see that the only subject where we see a significant impact is English, and it's a fairly large 0.1 standard deviation positive impact. Everything else looks more or less like a wash. The coefficient on biology is not small. Neither is the coefficient on Chichewa, and you notice that we do see a negative impact on their Chichewa score, though it's not significant. But it's maybe suggestive that they're improving their English skills at the cost of their Chichewa skills. Now, if we split this by students that were low achieving or high achieving at baseline, we see that high achievers actually didn't benefit at all from the Wikipedia access. And if anything, it looks like it had a negative impact. So it was a distraction for them. But none of that is significant. So it didn't really do much, maybe because their English skills are already quite good. But for low achievers, we see mostly positive impacts. So positive and significant for English and biology, positive, not significant for the other subjects that are taught in English, and negative for the subject that's taught in another language. So this is where this story is kind of building up in my mind, that this has to do with English skills, possibly more than anything else. So one thing we wanted to see was whether just having access to Wikipedia affected their career goals. So once they kind of learned about other career opportunities, or maybe got better in school or got better in biology, but we don't actually see a big change or a big difference between treatment and control. But at least you can see here what those career goals look like. So a lot of them want to be doctor or nurse, or other kind of medical field. And then you have a few kind of accounting, business type, lawyer, teacher, journalist, and then further down you have like engineers, and then others. But you can see that kind of biology and English are probably the most important subjects for these students, given their goals. Some other findings that we have, when we look at the browsing behavior of low achievers and high achievers, it's not that different. So it's not that the low achievers are like using Wikipedia for school and the high achievers are using it for distraction. They're all using it for they're all using it for fun, mostly. And spending about 1/5 of their time on school subjects. When we ask them how is Wikipedia for biology, they say that they prefer it to both their teachers and to their textbooks. And so maybe this matters more for low achievers. They say that they find Wikipedia easy to use and trustworthy. And when we look at their time use during the year, we see that they're shifting time away from other recreation activities to visit the digital library. So they're not shifting time away from studying, supposedly. Okay, so we find that students spend a lot of time reading articles that have nothing to do with their schoolwork when you give them access to Wikipedia. So at first, when we looked at the browsing data, this concerned us a little bit, right? Like if we just showed that to the schools, they might say, you know, this is not a good program. However, despite all of this kind of distraction, we don't find a negative impact on any subject. And instead, we find this positive impact on English, which is quite large for low achievers. And so maybe we need to think about, if you want students to improve their language skills, you need to give them access to reading material that is interesting to them, right? That they're going to be motivated to read on their own. And maybe that includes music, like entertainment, and so on. We see an improvement in biology scores for low achievers. This is not because they're studying biology more. It must be either because their language skills are improving, so this leads to improvements across the board, or because they need those easier study resources than what they have access to at school. Whereas the high achievers are doing just fine with their teachers and textbooks, and it's kind of like interchangeable for them. The fact that we see an impact on biology is not that surprising, because we do see that they spend a lot more time browsing biology than other school subjects. And they say that they like Wikipedia for that subject. If you ask them if Wikipedia is useful for math, they say no. So they're not just saying like, oh yeah, it's useful for everything. They specifically say that it's useful for biology. Okay, so we have some next steps with this project. A big one is that I'm working on a paper with Pedro Souza at Queen Mary, where we look at the impact of this intervention on the social network. So we actually map the whole network of friendships in all of the schools at baseline and endline. And we see that the students who had access to Wikipedia become central in the network. So students kind of like link to them in order to get information, presumably. But the most interesting thing is that they also link to them in terms of personal friendships. So it's kind of an interesting result in terms of how information matters for who you link to in a social network, and how social networks can change endogenously when you have an intervention. We're also thinking about looking at long-run impacts, both on kind of academic outcomes, but also on how they use the internet after they leave school. So whether they do more fact checking on Wikipedia, whether they're less likely to believe internet conspiracies and stuff like that, whether they're more likely to use the internet after having that experience in high school. And we're also thinking about maybe doing a paper that delves a little bit deeper into the kind of sexual health browsing that the students did to understand that a little bit more. Okay, so that's all I had. Happy to take questions if there are questions.
Thanks very much, Laura. That was really interesting. We've got a couple of questions, but we'll just start with the first question that we ask everyone, and we'll record this one and not any of the others. But what are some books that you recommend folks?
Oh no, you told me you were going to ask that, and then I forgot.
Oh, that's okay. We can take it on. We can take it on notice, unless something jumps to mind.
Is it supposed to be like academic books or any kind of books?
Anything you like. You can take it on notice if you'd like.
Yeah, let's take it. Let me get back to you. Yeah.
I'll just stop recording.